She was mocked in church for daring to dream of love again, whispered about, dismissed, humiliated. But one Sunday, as she quietly cleaned up after service, the pastor crossed the room, took her hand, and asked her something that left the entire congregation in stunned silence. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The faint scent of old hymnals and wood polish lingered in the heavy air as Grace Whitmore sat motionless in the third pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, fingers covered by thin, worn gloves. Light filtered through the high-arched windows, painting slanted patches of muted color on the scuffed floorboards and the faded cushions beneath her. At 58, Grace's frame was slender, her back straight, despite the toll of years spent bending over kitchens, hospital beds, and graves. Her hair, a soft silver, was pinned neatly into a modest bun, with only the slightest wisp daring to brush her cheek. Her simple navy dress, modest in cut and well cared for despite its age, spoke of a woman who took pride not in embellishment, but in quiet grace. Around her, the familiar murmur of post-service conversation filled the vaulted sanctuary, a tapestry of voices stitched together by Sunday ritual. Smiles were exchanged, programs folded, plans for potlucks and sewing circles casually discussed. It was here, among the women she had known for decades, that Grace allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. She spoke of hope, of the desire to find companionship once again, of the quiet yearning that had taken root in her after Henry's death, growing stronger with each passing winter. The response was immediate, sharp-edged and barbed beneath the veneer of civility. A stiff little laugh from Mrs. Calloway 2 rows back. A raised brow from young Lydia Parsons, whose engagement ring still gleamed fresh and bright on her hand. Murmured words, not quite hidden. At her age? Pathetic. Grace heard every syllable, each one landing like a pebble against glass. But she did not flinch. She did not bow her head or let her face crumple beneath the weight of humiliation. Instead, she straightened her spine, let her smile remain. Small, steady, an act of quiet rebellion. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs, a reminder that it still beat, still longed, despite what the world around her seemed to say. In the shadowed rear of the church, Pastor Thomas Carter leaned against the frame of the open door, observing it all with a heart heavier than he cared to admit. At 62, life had carved deep lines into his broad face, but his eyes remained steady and sharp. He had witnessed cruelty before, the casual kind that pretended at kindness yet left deep wounds. But something about Grace's lonely bravery, her refusal to wither under the soft violence of mockery, stirred a place inside him that had been dormant for years, a place he had almost convinced himself was long since buried. He watched as she gathered her purse and hymn book with quiet dignity, nodding politely to those who would not meet her gaze. There was no bitterness in her, no sharpness or defensive anger, only a steady, unwavering hope that, against all odds, refused to be snuffed out. And as Thomas Carter stood there, hidden in plain sight, a thought came unbidden. Maybe hope was not foolish at all. Maybe it was the purest kind of faith. The days unspooled slowly, each one stitched with a weight Grace Whitmore had not expected, but could not ignore. The glances she received at Dawson's Market felt different now, no longer warm or casual, but measured, clipped at the edges with silent disapproval. Conversations seemed to pause when she walked into the post office, only to resume once she had turned her back. Words like desperate, foolish, and poor thing were never spoken to her face, but hung in the air like stale perfume, unmistakable and hard to breathe through. And yet, Grace did not retreat. Each morning she rose before the sun, brushed out her silver hair, twisted it into a neat bun, and dressed with the same quiet care she always had. Favoring soft blues, warm browns, gentle patterns that echoed the softness of her spirit. She baked bread twice a week, delivering loaves to the widow Barton, whose arthritic hands could no longer knead dough. She mended quilts for the church sale. She stood with the alto section in the choir, her voice not powerful but steady, a thread of light in the hymns they sang. Her steps were calm, her tone kind. She listened more than she spoke, but the ache, though hidden, never left. It surfaced in the quiet moments, when the phone didn't ring, when she passed by homes where she used to be welcome, when she opened her mailbox and found nothing but bills and silence. The invitations to tea, to garden club meetings, to porch-side chats had slowed to a trickle, and then to nothing at all. It wasn't just loneliness. It was something deeper. It was the unspoken verdict that her yearning had made her unseemly, as if a widow's dreams ought to be buried beside her husband. And someone noticed. From the small study above the rectory kitchen, Pastor Thomas Carter watched her in the margins of his days. He saw how she lingered after choir to stack hymnals when no one asked, how she brought her own teacup to meetings, knowing no one would pour for her, how her smile, though intact, had grown quieter, a thing she wore, not a thing she lived in. He did not speak of it to anyone, but each night, when the pews were empty and the sanctuary still, he would pause in the center aisle, hands folded at his chest, and whisper a prayer. Not for Grace to find love, but for her not to lose her courage. And for him, if he dared, to find the strength to offer her more than just silence. The fellowship hall still hummed with the low, familiar sounds of Sunday, the clatter of casserole dishes being scraped clean, the rustle of folding chairs, the mingled chatter of old friends catching up over lukewarm coffee. A faint note of lemon pie lingered in the air, cut by the clean scent of hymn book pages and cedar floor polish. Grace stood at the far end of the room, her back to the crowd, carefully covering a tray of uneaten slices with wax paper. Her movements were practiced, deliberate, the way one works when they're trying not to think too much. She wore a pale gray dress that day, a delicate floral brooch pinned just above her heart. Her silver hair, as always, was pinned in place with modest elegance, and though she kept her posture straight and her shoulders pulled back, there was a quiet exhaustion in the curve of her spine, the kind that comes not from labor, but from being quietly wounded for too long without a balm. Across the room, Pastor Thomas Carter watched her in stillness. His hands, large and calloused, were folded in front of him, gripping the edges of his sermon notes more tightly than he realized. He had preached that morning on kindness, on how the smallest grace could soften the hardest hour. And yet he knew how many in this room had failed to live it. He could no longer bear to be one of them. Without announcement, without excuse, he crossed the room with slow, sure steps. The murmur of the crowd dimmed slightly, curiosity rising like a shift in wind. Some looked up from their plates. Others simply paused mid-sentence. Grace turned as his footsteps approached, blinking once in mild surprise, her hand still resting gently on the tray of pies. Thomas stopped in front of her. His navy suit, though pressed, bore the slight wrinkles of long use. A worn wedding band still sat on his left hand, a quiet echo of a life once lived. But his eyes, when they met hers, were steady, clear, unmistakably certain. "Grace," he said softly, but not so softly that the others couldn't hear. "Would you allow me the honor of courting you?" The room froze, chairs stilled, forks hovered mid-air. No one spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was charged, suspended, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Grace didn't answer at first. She looked at him, really looked at him. Her breath caught halfway between disbelief and wonder. Color rushed to her cheeks, and her hand trembled ever so slightly where it still held the edge of the tray. For a fleeting moment, she seemed to shrink, A woman braced for laughter, for ridicule, for another rejection dressed as kindness. But then, she didn't. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and her lips curled into the smallest, most luminous smile Thomas had ever seen. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But in that moment, surrounded by a room that had judged her, she reclaimed the space she had been denied, not by defiance, but by simply being worth choosing. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and golden, as if the sky itself understood that this day was not for grandeur but for gentleness. Sunlight filtered through the trees outside St. Andrew's Church in long, quiet ribbons, catching the edges of the chapel windows and igniting the stained glass into a hush of crimson, amber, and blue. There were no ornate decorations, no towering cakes or rented chandeliers. The pews were dressed with simple white ribbons and sprigs of lavender tied by hand, a gesture from the women of the choir, some of whom had once whispered about grace, but now tied those bows with quiet reverence. There were fewer guests than most weddings, but those who came, neighbors, widows, veterans, young couples, old farmers in their best clean boots, came not out of curiosity, but respect. Grace Whitmore entered from the back of the chapel in a dress of ivory linen, stitched with her own hands. It flowed to her ankles in soft folds, and at the collar, delicate lace framed the lines of a woman who had weathered many seasons. Her silver hair was swept into a chignon, a single pearl pin tucked just above her ear. She walked slowly, steadily, no veil to hide behind. Her face open, radiant, lit from within by something far deeper than mere happiness. Thomas stood waiting at the altar. His suit, the same one he wore every Sunday, had never fit more perfectly. His shoulders were square, his eyes bright. In his hand, he held not a polished speech, but a small, worn Bible marked at a passage about love that endures, believes, and never boasts. When he looked at her, it wasn't with nervousness or spectacle. It was with a reverence so deep, it seemed to still the very air. They exchanged vows not with trembling voices, but with steady ones, voices that had known both sorrow and silence, and had chosen to speak anyway. No one wept loudly, but there were tears, quiet, steady, heartfelt. Especially when Thomas, with calloused hands, slipped a plain gold band onto Grace's finger and bowed his head before pressing a kiss to her knuckles, not out of show, but as if to honor the road she had walked to stand before him. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was not thunderous, but it filled the space like light. It was a release, a celebration not only of love, but of redemption. Of a woman who had been dismissed, overlooked, even pitied, now standing as a bride, chosen not in spite of her years, but because of them. Outside, as the bells rang through the Tennessee sky, Grace and Thomas stood arm in arm beneath the chapel's old wooden arch. Guests moved around them like a slow river, some offering hugs, others simply smiling with eyes filled with something like wonder. And Grace, in that moment, did not feel transformed. She felt restored. As the sun warmed her shoulders and Thomas squeezed her hand, she whispered to herself words that no one else heard, but that she had longed to believe. I was never too old to be loved again. And the breeze, gentle and approving, carried that truth into the fields beyond.